this working? Oh yeah, okay, okay. Hello everybody. How you doing? Hope you had a nice break. So, I'm very happy to be here. My name is Daniele. I work in developer relations at Pipedrive, and I'm here today to talk to you about OAuth. Who here is familiar with OAuth? Can you raise your hand? Okay, some. So the idea is I will explain a little bit what it is, how it works, and then I will share some things that we learned in Pipedrive while implementing OAuth and while releasing it for our marketplace. All right? Sounds good? Okay. So, just to give you a little bit of context, this is Estonia. It's where Pipedrive was founded. It's a country known for the cold weather and the cool software companies. And Pipedrive is one of those. Yeah, thanks. And was founded in 2010. We have over 80 million in funding now. We are more than 400 people working in Pipedrive. And this is some of the people from the Estonian offices. So what do we do? Pipedrive is not a security-related product. We're actually a CRM for salespeople. That we have some cool features. You can see some here. We focus a lot on activities. We try to make everything very easy for salespeople so that they can focus on the things that they can control in their sales pipeline. All right. So why am I here talking about OAuth? One thing that we know is that it's impossible to create a CRM that covers 100% of every possible need that salespeople have. So that's why we created a marketplace, which is a space where other companies and other developers can create apps that work with Pipedrive to cover those needs that salespeople have, but we don't cover natively. Okay? And this is where I come in the picture. Again, my name is Daniele, and working in developer relations means that I talk with these developers, I talk with these companies, and I try to make their lives easier. So if there's something to improve with our libraries, I work on that, or do some support. And one of the main topics that comes up all the time is OAuth, because it can be tricky sometimes. So the idea for this presentation is I will try to explain it in the easiest way possible, so that I'll save some of you some time when you have to deal with it in the future. So let's start with the definition. OAuth is an open standard for access delegation. And what does that mean? So, if you're a user of any platform, you have access to some private resources through a password, okay? Now, what happens if you want to share some of these resources with someone else, with a third-party platform? The way it used to work before OAuth was released, back in 2007 or so, looked like this. So you would share your password. Now, I don't think I need to explain at a security conference why this is a bad idea, but aside from the obvious reason that you don't want to give all that access to someone else, there's something else more practical, maybe in a way. Anybody has some ideas? You can just shout it out. No one? So, there's another thing. If I share my password with 10 people, it's impossible for me to revoke access to only one of these. Because if I change the password, I revoke access to everybody. And if I don't change the password, everybody still has access, okay? So it's not the best approach. A better way to handle this is by delegating the granting of permission to something else, which is the OAuth server, which acts like a bouncer and sits in the middle between the private resources and the third-party platform, okay? So based on rules that the user decides, it can grant permission to some of these platforms and deny permission to some others. So in our example, in our case, when a user installs one of these applications, they are prompted with a page that says, hey, this application needs to have access to your contacts, your deals, your activities. Are you okay with that? If you are, you install the application. Has anybody ever done a login with Google or Facebook? Okay. Yeah, I thought so. It's basically the same thing, even though that's built on OAuth. There's a piece of protocol on top of it. It's a different protocol. It's called OpenID Connect, but it's basically the same thing. The concept is the same. And so the application is installed. So the private resource is the Pipedrive account. The guest in this example is the client application, for example, Asana. And the bouncer is the authentication server. So we didn't always have OAuth in Pipedrive, like many other companies and platforms that provide an API. We started with API tokens. Do you know what an API token is? What an API key is? Okay. Good. So it's basically like a password. It's just a string that you can include with all your API calls. It's just an extra parameter, and it's all you need to start using an API. It's a very fast and easy way to start using the API. And it's, especially if you're trying to build something internally, like for your own company. It's not the best solution if you want to share the application that you are creating with the whole world. Because, for a few reasons. First of all, it's complicated for the final user, because like if you develop an application that uses API token, and I want to use it, I need to go to my Pipedrive account, copy the API token, come to your platform and paste it. So it's kind of not the best user experience. And again, it has the same problems that sharing a password has. You're giving access to everything, and again, you cannot revoke access to only one of these platforms. All right? With OAuth, on the other hand, it's very easy for the final user to start using your application because the installation is very easy. It's just one click. And you can define scopes, which means you can define certain subsets of resources that your application needs to have access to work. Okay? So, yeah, and so the user, when they install the application, can see what kind of data you need to have access to. They're much more comfortable with it, and it's much more likely that they will give your application a shot. All right? So let's see how the protocol works. We'll focus mainly on the authorization code flow. There are 4 different variants of OAuth. This is the variation that is used every time that you're dealing with marketplaces and applications, whether it's for Pipedrive, GitHub, Spotify, or whatever. So there are a few actors involved. There is the final user. There is a client, which doesn't mean front end or browser. It means the client application is still a server. For example, Asana, there is an authentication server and there is a resource server. Now these two, they could be 2 different servers. It could be one server. It could be a complex architecture. But for simplicity, I will just call this Pipedrive. All right? So the goal of the whole OAuth flow is for the client to have access to the user's resources. And how does it do that? Using what's called an access token. The first access token is exchanged for what is called an authentication code, and we'll see we'll see how it works. And then every once in a while, the access token expires. So the client needs to what's called refresh it. The term refresh is a little bit ambiguous. There's nothing that's being refreshed, really. You just ask for a new access token, but that's what it's called. So, first step, the page that we've seen before, the client asks the user through the server, can I have access to your data? If the user approves, the server redirects to the client with this authentication code. The client receives the authentication code and can exchange it for the first pair of access token and refresh token. And so it can now use this access token to make API calls, for example, to get a list of contacts or anything else. And then, after a while, the access token expires, and the client needs to request a new one using the refresh token. Okay? Are you with me so far? Cool. So let's see how what calls are actually made. A little step back. Every time you are dealing with an authentication flow, you need to first register your app, which means you need to create it on the platform that you're using, in this case, Pipedrive. And you type in some data, but the most important thing is the callback URL. So this is, you're telling the server where the user should be redirected after they approve the installation. Okay? And also the list of data that you need to have access to. And what kind of access? Is it read-only? Is it read and write? After you create the application, after you register it, you are given a client ID and a client secret. And this is how the server can identify the application. So the user installs, again, is prompted with this page. But if you take a look at the URL bar right there, you can see that you have the client ID that we just talked about, and the redirect URI. So where should I be redirected after installing this application? I install, and voila, I'm redirected to this very ugly client right now, but it's just to show you what's going on. I'm redirected to the client. See, this is the redirect URL. Plus, I have this code right now. It's the authentication code, the first step of the flow. So everything so far is visible, is on the browser, is on the front end, so you can see everything that's going on. From this point on, the calls that are made are server to server, so they're hidden from the user. Postman. Anybody uses Postman? Okay. It's just a tool with a very cool visual interface that you can use to make calls, HTTP requests, and so on. You can do more with it, but this is what I use it for. So the first call, after getting the access token, the authentication code, you need to request the first access token. Okay? And this is how the call is prepared. It needs to be authenticated with basic auth, so you need to have username and password, which will be encoded in base 64 in the actual final request. And in the body of the request, you have grant type, authorization code in this case, code, the authentication code that is being generated by the server, and the redirect URI, just to double check. The names of these parameters can change from platform to platform, but the concept is always the same. You send the authorization code and you get the first access token. So you send the request, and this is the response. Again, the parameters names could change, but you still get an access token, and usually a refresh token. We'll talk about it. So this is what you get. You receive an access token, a token type that is usually bearer, in how many milliseconds the access token will expire, and the refresh token. So you will need to use this one when you want to request a new access token. And you also get the list of resources, again, that you can have access to. So you receive the access token, and you can use it to make API calls. And how do you do that? You just include it in the header with bearer, space, and the token. In this case, Postman does that for you. Here I'm just making a simple GET request to get the deals of my account, and voila. Okay, it's very simple to use it. Then it expires. You need to refresh it, and the request is very similar to the first one that we've seen. It just what changes is now you have grant type is refresh token, and refresh token is the refresh token, and you get a new access token. Now, if someone has very good eyes, maybe you notice that in this case, the refresh token that you are sending is actually the same to the one you are receiving. So, why is that? Does anybody have any idea? If you guess it correctly, I'll buy you a beer or something. It's tricky. So, the truth is that when you read the specifications of OAuth, this is what it says. It's optional to reissue the refresh token. So it's up to you when you are implementing the OAuth server to decide if you want your user to use always the same refresh token forever, or every time they use a refresh token, you reissue a new one. So it will basically be a one-use only refresh token. And in Pipedrive, we started reissuing refresh token in the beginning, and so all refresh tokens were just one use only. And we started having some issues with developers using our OAuth flow because they were not used to this thing. They were contacting us saying, we're having issues with your OAuth, it's not working, refresh tokens are not working, what's going on? So we started looking around. We asked ourselves, what do other platforms do? So this is how Pipedrive used to work. So first time you get a refresh token, second time you get a different one. Then you go and look, for example, to Spotify. This is the response to the first request. You get an access token and a refresh token. But then when you use a refresh token, this is what you get. You only get an access token. So what does that mean? It means that the same refresh token can be used more than once. You can always use the same refresh token. Then you look someone else like GitHub, and this is the response to the first request. You only get the access token. You don't get refresh token at all. So that single access token will last forever. Okay? And so, as I said, we started reissuing refresh tokens, but we thought, it's cool, it should be more secure, right? It makes sense. But it turns out that maybe it's more secure. I don't even know. But it definitely adds an extra layer of complexity that it looks not so complex, but developers, turns out, are not used to it. So you get a lot of support requests and failed refresh token requests. So after changing after stopping reissuing refresh tokens, the situation got much better. And we left in the response that we are sending still the same refresh token, just not to break those that already had the implementation correctly and they were updating the refresh token every time. Okay? Make sense? So this is something cool something important to keep in mind. If you're implementing on OAuth server, I would suggest don't reissue the refresh tokens. And one final thing before closing the chapter. This is a custom endpoint that we created in Pipedrive, and it's an endpoint that's used to exchange an API token with the first pair of access token and refresh token. So, again, if you have your implementation using the API token, you can use this endpoint and exchange it, and for me, it would look like an app that I already installed. Okay, we did this because we had a lot of integrations built with API token, and we wanted to help them transition to actual app using the OAuth flow. We can talk more about it if you're interested. So this is what we've covered so far. Do you have any questions at this point before we move on? Yeah, go ahead. You get access. What happens if a password leaks? It's the same. Yeah, you can revoke the token. So yeah, so if again, because you have different access tokens for everyone, you can revoke just one. So if you find out that there has been a leak, you can just revoke that access token and make the user go through the whole flow again to request a new access token. Make sense? Yeah. So. I think I got the question. So the thing is, if my access token leaks, okay, that means that someone else is using it, is using the access token that should be my own, right? So you, the server, you can decide to revoke that access token, and for me, it will look like the application has been uninstalled. So I cannot use that application anymore. To start using it again, I need to go through the whole authentication, the page that says, do you want to install this again? I need to go through the whole thing again, and you get a new access token.
Okay, but what if instead of going through the whole process, you just ask for a new token with a refresh token?
So if the refresh token leaks?
No. If you leak the access token, the simplest way is to have the refresh token working. So the client could just use the refresh token to get a new one.
Yeah.
If you aren't implementing this as mandatory to have the refresh token working, it won't work. Does this make sense?
Yeah, so you're saying that you could request a new access token simply using the refresh token?
Yeah.
Yes, it just depends on who is doing. Like, if the client finds out that there's something wrong with one access token, it can refresh and get a new one. If instead you want to just revoke the whole thing, refresh token and access token, the user needs to go through the whole process again.
But didn't you say that the refresh token, you weren't using the refresh token because it was giving the developers problems?
What? Oh, go ahead. Maybe someone can.
The call for the refresh token includes the access token as well, right?
Sorry?
The call for the refreshing token also includes the access token. If the access token is revoked, it doesn't? Just the refresh token?
Just the refresh token. I don't know if I answered totally, but maybe we can talk about it later. All right. So, I'll share quickly some things that we learned while dealing with many apps, and then we'll take a look at cross-site request forgery attacks in this protocol. So, talking about synchronization with the clients, let's talk about webhooks. Do you know what a webhook is? Okay. So webhook is just a fancy name to describe a URL on the client that the server can call every time that something is triggered. Okay, it's just a trigger. Something happens, the server calls a URL on the client and sends probably some data. Why do we need webhooks? What are they used for? What's the problem? So when you have a client and a server dealing with data, often what you want to do is to keep the data synchronized in some way. So if something happens on the server, you want it to be mirrored on the client, okay? How do you achieve this? The old school way of doing this looked something like this. You would set a timer on the client, and every once in a while, you go and check what's going on the server. So you go, you check what's going on the server, you find some new data, and you download it on the client. Then you set the timer again. Something else happens on the server, but you don't know it yet, because you still are not looking into that. Then you go find out what's new on the server, and you copy the data, okay? It works, but of course, you are making unnecessary calls, because you are checking all the time, even when nothing happens. And the data is not updated in real time. So with a webhook, you reverse the whole thing. So simply when something happens on the server, some new data is created, for example, is the server that sends the data back to the client, okay? So you just do the minimum amount of calls necessary, and the data is always updated in real time. So it's not the only application that you have for webhooks. So let's talk a little bit about uninstallations and trial expirations. What's the issue? When a user installs an application, the client starts making some requests, some API calls, and the server checks if everything looks good or not, and the request can be approved or rejected, okay? When the user uninstalls an application or the trial expires or something else happens, this is what the situation looks like. You have all the requests are rejected because that client should not have access to anything anymore, all right? But what's the problem? The problem is that the client has no way of knowing that, like on its own. So it will keep trying to make this request, which will be rejected. So how do you solve it? With a webhook. So when the application is uninstalled, you send back to the client, hey, you've been uninstalled, stop making requests, okay? And also, you should provide an endpoint for revoking the access token from the client. So if, for example, the app is a paid app and the user stops paying, the application should be able to uninstall itself, okay? So this is another endpoint that should be provided. Similarly, when an app is installed, it can create its own webhooks. So it can say, hey server, every time that something happens, I want you to send the data back to me. And again, what's the issue? If the app is uninstalled, all the requests coming from the client are rejected again. But if you don't do anything else, you still have data going from the server to the client. Okay, so it's very simple. Again, you just need to remember to delete these webhooks. And this could look like obvious things, but turns out sometimes you don't figure it out until you are dealing with many apps and many requests. All right, so this is the kind of the final chapter, and I wanted to talk about this because it's something important to understand, but it's not always clear for all developers. How cross-site request forgeries attacks work in this protocol and how you can prevent them using the state parameter. And it's not clear for everybody because sometimes, so first of all, what is the state parameter? It's an optional parameter per specification that you can include in the flow. And it's a parameter that can prevent that kind of attacks. It's just a string that is bounced back and forth between the client and the server. The server sends it back to the client as it is, doesn't even touch it. You can see here there is the URL that we've seen before with the code, plus a state parameter. And it's not totally clear always how this works, because if you Google and try to understand it on your own, you sometimes find websites that say things like, if you don't use the state parameter, an attacker could gain access to a victim's resources, which is kind of true, but it's not precise. It's a bit more clear if you read the specification. So the important bit is the last part. So it says that it's the victim that can be tricked into saving their own private data, thinking that they're saving it to their own account, but instead they're saving it on the attacker's account. Okay? So we'll see how a normal flow works, we'll see how the attack works, and then we'll see how the state parameter can prevent it. In a normal flow, just to recap, the user installs the application, the authorization server generates an authentication code that's linked to that specific user. The user is redirected to the client with this code, exchanges the code for an access token that's also linked to that specific account, and then the client can use this access token to make API calls, for example, to send in a new lead. Okay? That ends up on that specific account because that access token is linked to that account. Okay? So how does the attack work? The attacker starts the process just like any other user. Okay? So they approve the app, an authorization code is generated on the server, but at this point, instead of being redirected to the client with this code, they interrupt the request. As we've seen before, it's just a URL, right? So you just take that URL and you have the victim go to this URL instead of them. And this can happen in a number of ways. It can be in a malicious email. It can be hidden somewhere, iframes, images, so on. So let's see what happens. The client goes to the user goes to the client with his authorization code that's linked to the attacker's account. The code is exchanged for an access token, and now the user is sending the data through the client using an access token that's linked to the attacker's account. Okay, and so this is how the data ends up actually on the attacker's account. All right. So how do you solve this using the state parameter? The state parameter is generated by the client, and it's a string that identifies uniquely that specific session, which means that specific user. Okay, and this parameter is passed with each step of the flow. So when the user is redirected to the client with this code, there is also a state parameter that identifies it's me. It's the same session. Okay, and in the same way, the attacker has a state parameter that's linked to their own account. So now, if the attacker tries to have the victim go to this URL instead of them, well, it's very easy now for the client to see, hey, the session that is making the request, it's not the same of this state parameter that I'm receiving. So there's something fishy going on, and the request can simply be rejected. This is something that is optional also in Pipedrive because it's optional per specification. I don't think we'll ever enforce it, but if you are developing an app using the OAuth flow, it's definitely recommended that you use it. I don't know why it's optional, honestly, the specifications. Maybe someone knows, can tell me. But yeah, it's definitely recommended that you use it. We've talked about a few things. Do you have any more questions? Was it clear enough? Yeah? For those who were new to the whole thing? Yeah? Yeah. Shy audience. It's cool. If you have any more questions, anyway, I'll be around. We can clarify that thing as well. Thank you for your attention, guys. Thank you for. Oh, there is a question.
Hey, not really a question. I was just going to say that that state parameter. Yeah. I've seen it used as a way to basically pass information through the OAuth flow. So basically, let's imagine that you can come from two different places. Mm-hmm. So I've seen clients pass random stuff into the state, saying homepage or yes, yeah, and basically not utilizing the code as it used to be, or simply ignoring it, like getting a CSRF error and what is this, and simply ignore the code because it was breaking the OAuth flow.
It's simply, say again?
Simply when it breaks, since the basically imagine that you were using a OAuth client that would make the verification of the code for yourself, mm-hmm. and it was breaking. So then clients would simply pass ignore state, the ignore state option, and that way it would work.
Okay.
So basically, clients don't know what the code does. So basically, either ignore it or use it for something else.
Yeah. So as I said, it's parameter. The server doesn't do anything with it. It just sends it back. So yes, it's up to the client to decide how to use it. And this is how it should be used to prevent this kind of attack. But yes, it can be used to just know, for example, where the user was, what the user was doing before they went to the whole flow, so that they can restart from the same point or something like that. It should be used for, if you want to do that, you can do it. It's probably a good idea to do both things. So you generate a string that has the information of what you were doing at that point, and also has a way of identifying that session. But yes, it's totally up to the client. Yeah. Rock and roll. Thank you for your attention, guys. Thank you for having me.